Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's episode by episode review for Lost Season 1, Part 3. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Lost in parts. In this video, I will cover episodes 17 through 25 of Season 1, which take us full to the season finale. I'll have to start with a spoiler warning up to the end of Season 1. If you haven't seen up to the Season 1 finale, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. However, if you haven't seen beyond Season 1, not to worry, this video will not contain spoilers past Season 1. However, I will have a spoiler section at the end of the video for those who have seen the entire series of Lost. So, Lost, at least for the first 4 seasons, have had a tradition of having the strongest part of the season be at the end, where it ends with a strong series of episodes towards the end of the season. This isn't the case with Season 5 and 6, in fact, it's probably the opposite for those seasons, but for the first 4 seasons, the end of the season is definitely the strongest, and that is certainly the case in Season 1, as I found this batch of episodes is definitely the strongest that I have reviewed so far, featuring some of my favorite episodes of the entire show, and no episode that I would consider bad. There's a couple episodes in here that have weak island storylines and strong flashbacks, but nothing I would consider bad. And overall, this is the moment in the show I would say it really got good and found its footing. So let's go ahead and jump into the episode, starting with episode 17, In Translation. So the title is supposed to be all clever because it's relying on how the show is called Lost, and so the title finishes in translation, like Lost in Translation. Anyways, I always liked this episode and thought it was a strong and underrated episode. I would often try to fit it into my top 20 list just because I thought it deserved more recognition. But honestly, I don't think it quite fits up that high with the best of the best. But it's still a good episode. So first off, this is the episode where the building of the raft really comes into focus. It was mentioned briefly in the episode special, but here it becomes the main focus. I will say the main storyline of someone burning the raft and everyone thinks is Jen wasn't that interesting, and it did feel kind of like an aside. It was at least much better than that silly polar bear storyline in special. And it did allow for some great character moments and character development. None the least being the revelation to the rest of the survivors that Sun speaks English. We also get an iconic scene at the end of the episode with what is, in my opinion, the best musical montage in the season with the song Delicate. A song I started listening to on a regular basis because of this episode, because the episode used it so well. The song was also used in the show House MD, and I believe possibly another show I've watched as well, but I can't remember at the moment. But the way it was used here was by far the best use of the song, as it plays as Sun is able to go swimming in her bikini, something that Jin would never let her do, and so perfectly portrays the bittersweetness of Sun finally being free of Jin. And I love how it ended with Hurley's CD player batteries dying, so the song cuts out in the middle. That did have a nice sense of eeriness to it. And we also get the epic Locke speech where he talks about the others, saying that they've attacked us, murdered us, sabotaged us, and we're not the only ones on this island, and we all know it. If you didn't watch this show when it first aired, you may not be aware how often this clip was used in the previously on segments, in the commercials, recaps. It was like the quintessential speech that explained who the others were. And ironically, this speech was made to implicate the others in the burning of the raft, something that Locke knew full well they weren't responsible for. He just used them as a scapegoat because he knew Jen didn't do it either, and that it was in fact Walt whom Locke was covering for. Also in that speech he says, why would anyone want to sabotage our attempts to leave the island? Which is also ironic because that's exactly what he did when he attacked Saeed earlier. Still a good speech though. But what makes this episode really good is the Jen flashbacks, which I absolutely loved because it built off of Sun's flashbacks seen in the episode House of the Rising Sun, but gave us a totally new perspective and makes us question what we thought we knew as we get Jen's side of the story, which I always love when stories do that. I think this is something Lost does particularly well, and this is a good example of that. As in Jen's flashback, he's portrayed, in Sun's flashback, Jen is portrayed a bit as a monster, but here we see that he's being forced by Sun's father. It was particularly interesting. We got the backstory of how Jen came home with the blood on his hands, but it turns out that he beat up a man in order to save his life because her father wanted to kill him, and that was an extremely powerful scene, especially seeing Jen cry after Sun leaves the room over the situation he's in. And it's interesting that to his father, Jen says that in the good world, Sun would hate her father and not him, since he's the one who's really responsible for all this evil shit. But on the other hand, Jen should open up to her about this instead of acting like a tough guy, which only serves to alienate her more. But that's his pride getting in the way. It's an interesting story, as in fact that the fact that he lied about his father being dead because he was ashamed of him. I thought that scene where he goes to his father for advice and he tells him to run away to America with Sun was a very powerful, really emotionally effective scene. Also, there was a nice little Easter egg when Jen first goes to deliver the message to the government official, has the government official's daughter is watching TV, because we see on the TV there's a newscast of Hurley winning the lottery. A nice little Easter egg setting up for the next episode. However, the obvious drawback of this episode was the storyline with Shannon and Saeed falling in love. I already talked about how this storyline sucked in the previous video I did, so I won't get too much into it again. But this episode had a particularly dumb storyline about Boone telling Saeed that Shannon uses people, so Saeed stops talking to her, but then she convinces her to go back. But otherwise, it was a pretty good episode. So, next episode is Numbers, and this is one of my favorite episodes of the entire show. I absolutely love it. It is heavy on mythology as it introduces the concept of the numbers, which will become a major component of the show. But as an episode itself, I think it really works. It is very effectively creepy and spooky in a way that is unique to Lost, as it uses the concept of destiny and a greater unknown force, and it ties the spooky element and the flashbacks directly to the island storyline. So I think it's absolutely genius. Not only is it creepy and intriguing, but also humorous at times, as it is a Hurley episode after all. But unlike some other Hurley episodes in the future, it isn't overly goofy or doesn't rely too much on comedy. Instead, perfectly blends the comedy with incredibly eerie and effective way. But more than that, it's also a great character exploration for Hurley. It's a bit odd that they waited till the end of the season to do a Hurley-centric episode where all the other main characters had already had centric episodes, including Boone. I kind of get the feeling that's because the writers weren't quite sure what they wanted to do with Hurley, as his shtick was that he was basically the everyman. So I think that made crafting an interesting backstory for him a bit more difficult. So eventually they settled on this idea, which is possibly the most fantastical backstory they've ever come up with. I mean, Claire's is kind of with like the psychic, and Walt has superpowers, but those aren't really explored. And Locke's healing ability isn't really a backstory, just something that about the island. So Hurley winning the lottery using the numbers that he heard a guy at a mental institution ranting, and then because of that, he becomes bad luck and bad things happen to everyone around him. This is supernatural and fantastical, and it's tied directly to the island, which is the first time we see a character have ties to the island before they came to it. Because the numbers that Lenny at the mental institution were repeating are numbers he heard in a transmission from the Pacific. So it's heavily implied that this transmission came from the island. This is backed up even more when Rousseau states that hearing the transmission with the numbers is what brought her to the island. And on top of that, the numbers were on the hatch, and thus these numbers from the island reach Hurley in Los Angeles and affect his life, and his search to discover answers for the numbers is what brings him on the flight that just so happens to crash on the island. It's fascinating to think about. A lot of scenes of of the bad luck perfectly combine humor and creepiness, such as when Hurley tries to give his mother a gift of the new house. The house catches on fire and she breaks her ankle, and then he gets arrested for being mistaken for a drug dealer. That was pretty funny, but creepy at the same time. Or when he's talking to his accountant about the numbers being unlucky, and the accountant says he's being ridiculous, and then just as he says that, someone falls outside the window to their death. That was very funny and creepy. But the scene where Hurley goes to the mental institution and Lenny all of a sudden starts freaking out when Hurley mentions winning the lottery with the numbers, saying, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that. You opened the box." That was a really creepy scene. One of the most, I dare say, one of the most creepy I've ever seen. But was even better was the scene when Hurley was in Australia, and the wife of Sam Tooney was telling the story of Sam and how he won a bean counting prize at a fair and then was surrounded by bad luck and bad things happened to everyone around him, so eventually he killed himself over that. That was really fucking creepy. I absolutely love that scene. I think it's one of the best of the entire show. And while I don't think the island story was quite as good as the plot about Hurley running off to get batteries from Rousseau for the raft was kind of throwaway, it was still a really interesting character story for Hurley that tied into the flashbacks nicely, as it showed Hurley acting out of character and going gung-ho to find answers about the numbers. And the scene where he confronts Rousseau about the numbers was absolutely amazing, as he demands some freaking answers, even while she points a gun at him. And when she admits that the numbers are cursed, he finally finds someone who agrees with him. He finally finds validation that he's been looking for. That was actually a really great, clever way to resolve his character story in this episode. It was brilliant. And just a side note about the numbers for those who are watching the show for the first time. The numbers Hurley uses to win the lottery, 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42. These numbers constantly reoccur throughout the entire show. Every time a number is mentioned, even in passing, it's usually one of these numbers. You can even notice it in this season as the flight number of the flight that they crashed on the island on is 815. 8 and 15 being two of the numbers, and when you add them together, it equals 23, another one of the numbers. Also, in the finale, we see the flight is leaving from gate 23. When Jack talks to Ana Lucia, he mentions that he's in seat 23B and she's in seat 42F. Little Easter eggs like this are sprinkled throughout the show every time you see numbers. So that's something interesting to think about. So overall, I love this episode, and I think it is one of the best of the entire show. So next episode is Deus Ex Machina, and which is another great creepy episode that uses themes of destiny. This is a great follow-up to Walkabout, as it furthers Locke's storyline of just how pathetic he used to be before he came to the island, as we learn that he was an orphan that grew up in various foster homes and never knew his real parents, and here he meets his mother, which leads him to seek out his father, who turns out to be a con man who set the whole thing up just to con him out of his kidney. And then once he has the kidney, he just discards John. And so you really get to feel for John, as it is really tragic to see how he gets used. As it's obvious that his whole life he had a hole that needed to be filled by a father figure, that he never had a father figure. And once he gets that father figure, he just uses him and discards him. In fact, he preys off of the fact that Locke's need for a father figure. And the way these flashbacks were juxtaposed with the island storyline was rather brilliant, because here the island sends him a vision on what he needs to do. As he journeys with Boone, he finds that he's losing the use of his legs, something that the island gave him, which causes him distress similar to what he experienced with his father. As in that case, the one thing he needs in his life, a father figure, is he finally gets it only to have it taken away from him, whereas the island gives him the one thing he really wants, the gift, the use of his legs back, and it looks like the island is taking that away from him. And I just love this episode, as I think it's one of the best that deals with destiny and funky visions, and it really establishes the island as a character, as you can really feel Locke's connection with the island, and the funky vision that Locke receives is awesome and creepy. It's a really great dream sequence, one of the best I've seen, where Boone is just repeating, "Teresa falls up the stairs, Teresa falls down the stairs," in a very strange and weird voice, as you see flashes of him all bloody, which is nicely foreshadows his impending doom. And it was even more creepy when you actually hear the backstory of Teresa, as it was a nanny that Boone had as a child that he used to torment by making her climb it up and down stairs, and one day she slipped and broke her neck. That just adds to the creepiness nicely. And so this is what I mean by it establishes the island as a character, because the vision is obviously genuine, because it shows Locke the Beechcraft plane, which is real and they will discover in real life. Plus it mentions the thing about Teresa as a way for Locke to entice Boone to come on the journey with them, and it even knows that Boone will die in this journey, as it foreshadows this with his bloody face, and it takes away Locke's ability to walk just temporarily, ensuring that Boone will be the one who climbs the plane to his death and not John. Now, as Locke explains in the finale, these incidents is what set off a chain of events which led them eventually to the hatch with dynamite. So Locke thinks that he's going to find something to open the hatch with, but instead it starts off a chain of events that leads to the hatch being opened. But the chain of events begin with Boone's death, and it was an absolutely amazing scene where you see how upset Locke is over it, as at this stage it seems like the island had betrayed him, as the vision it gave him led to the death of his only friend on the island. And so we see him banging on the hatch yelling, "Why did you do this to me?" And this was intercut with the scenes of him yelling about being conned and discarded by his father. And again, this juxtaposition was amazing. And when the hatch light comes on, it was just a great moment, as it seems to reaffirm Locke's faith. This episode also has a good side plot about Sawyer getting headaches, and it turns out that he needs glasses. I actually thought this worked a lot, because it was funny, and the humor really worked, such as Jack asking Sawyer if he ever contracted an STD or slept with prostitutes, when he knew full well that Sawyer just needed glasses. But moreover, I found these great character building moments that established the survivors as a base community. Overall, I loved this episode. It was creepy, it was emotional, it was thought-provoking, and most of all, played on the weird themes of fate that Lost does so well in an excellent way. So next episode is Do No Harm, which is the crushing follow-up to Boone's fall, where we see Jack struggling to save Boone's life while Claire gives birth, and Jack is too preoccupied to help her. And on top of that, we get flashbacks from Jack's wedding to show that he was married. Now, I gotta be honest, I wasn't the biggest fan of those flashbacks, as it was all about him struggling over writing vows, which quite frankly is boring. And then it has like a ham-fisted speech from his dad about how he can't let go. And I do like how the theme of him not being able to let go was used well in the island storyline. In fact, will become a recurring theme for his character going forward. But it just seems like the flashbacks could have done a better job at doing this than a boring story about wedding vows. The flashbacks are more interesting for what is hinted at rather than what is actually shown. For example, if Jack was married, does that mean he has a wife out there waiting for him, or did he get divorced? And his wife talks about a backstory of him saving her life when no one else could, which sounds like an interesting setup, but the actual story scene here in this episode was just boring. However, I did love the island storyline of Jack trying to save Boone. It was great to see Jack actually being a doctor for once, and it's interesting that Sun took on the role as his nurse, as they only learned recently that Sun could speak English, and they had some great character interactions here, as Sun was the one who realized Jack was being obsessive and going overboard. This role is usually given to Kate, but with Sun doing it, it took on a different form, and I love how they use more of the minor characters instead of focusing too much on Jack, Kate, and Sawyer. Although I will say it does seem typical that Claire just so happens to go into labor the one moment where Jack is unavailable. It seems to me that the show really didn't want for Claire to just have a uneventful birth, and it needed it to be suspenseful in some way. It was a bit convenient too that Kate be the one that Jack said to deliver the baby. What? Just because she just so happened to be there? It seems like she was just as qualified as anyone else. And Jen and Charlie were there, but for some reason they had to stand back aside and they couldn't even help. Well, okay, I can see why they didn't want Charlie to help, because he was just too much of a mess and too emotionally invested. And I did ultimately like these scenes, particularly Kate's speech about how they were all there for her and they were all there to help them. That was actually pretty touching. Although I did find the moment where Claire was holding her breath and fighting the birth a bit contrived. It didn't really make sense and was just there to artificially create tension. But overall, I still like these scenes. But what I think really made this episode good was the ending sequence, which is not the first, but probably the most memorable, iconic use of the life and death theme music, which was named after this episode, in fact, because it was the theme of new life coming into the world with Claire's baby, while at the same time Boone lost his life. And the moment we see Jack break the news to Shannon about her brother's death, with no dialogue, just music playing over it, was a very effective scene. I got to say, it brings me to tears every time. Now, as far as Boone dying, I think his death had a lot more impact on the show than his life did, as frankly he was a useless character who was never that interesting. So their decision to kill him was totally the right one, but the way they executed it was absolutely brilliant and really elevated the show and actually made Boone a worthwhile character by killing him off in such a powerful way. So all in all, pretty good episode. So next episode is The Greater Good. And this is one of these episodes I was referring to that have good, powerful flashbacks, but the island story is kind of lacking. As the island story is about the aftermath of Boone's death, with Jack accusing Locke of murdering him. This causes Shannon to want Locke dead, but when Saeed refuses to kill him, she goes to take matters in her own hands. And I gotta be honest, I didn't buy this at all. First off, I think Jack was going a bit overboard accusing Locke of murder. I understand he'd be upset about Locke lying about how Boone got injured, but yelling at him and starting a fight at Boone's funeral I felt a bit melodramatic to me. But what I really don't buy is Shannon's behavior. Yes, I get she'd be upset over Boone's death and would want revenge and on the man that she saw responsible, so I do buy her going to Saeed. I just don't buy her stealing the gun herself and threatening to shoot Locke, which apparently she would have done had Saeed not stopped her. So this felt really out of character for her and just a way for the show to create tension in this episode. In fact, when I saw the scene of Shannon opening the case and getting the gun out, it just looks comical. I just don't buy it. So this felt, but at the very least, it ended the stupid Shannon-Saeed romance, which never should have existed in the first place. However, I did like the scenes with Saeed interrogating Locke, as Locke took him to the plane in which Boone fell and died. So this was a great use of Saeed, as Jack was clearly too upset and charged to properly interrogate Locke, and I like how it establishes Saeed as someone who's very intelligent and clever, as he can tell when Locke is lying and when he isn't. Of course, it also establishes that Locke was the one who knocked out Saeed when he tried to find the source of the transmission, something I think the writers just came up with and after the fact, and it doesn't really fit with the events of The Moth, but it establishes Locke as someone who would sabotage people's attempts to get rescued. But what I really liked about this episode were the flashbacks, which I much prefer to Saeed's earlier flashbacks, as although this isn't about him in Iraq, it's about him being involved with terrorists in Sydney, and as the episode itself points out, that Saeed is not a terrorist, but they explain that he just so happened to be friends with the man who became a terrorist. So these flashbacks had a real 24 feeling to them, but I think they still really work because they focus more on Saeed's personal story. I love how he forms a bond with this man but is forced to lie to him and basically convince him to participate in a suicide bombing just so the CIA can catch him. And the ending conclusion where Saeed confesses this to him, but the man puts a gun to Saeed's head over the fact that he betrayed him over a woman, and then says, "I hope she makes you whole again," before shooting himself in the head, was a very powerful scene. Overall, I found this storyline very thought-provoking and powerful and explains a lot of who Saeed is. But as I said, the island story wasn't quite as good. It was still okay. So all in all, I'd say this was a good episode. So after that, we get Born to Run, which is yet another example of an episode. I'd say the flashbacks were very strong, but the island story was weak. In this episode, it's revealed to everyone that Kate was a fugitive, that the marshal was escorting, and it had absolutely zero impact on anything. Some people give her some nasty looks, ooh, but that's about it. In fact, when I rewatch, I often forget that everyone didn't already know that she was the fugitive earlier in the season, because it changes pretty much nothing. People still treat her exactly the same. And the whole storyline about Kate trying to steal Sawyer's spot on the raft, what a snooze fest. Who cares? But I absolutely love the Kate flashbacks, and they are probably my favorite Kate flashbacks of the entire show. While it doesn't explain why she's a fugitive, because she's already a fugitive at the start of the story, it does explore her character in wonderful ways and how being a fugitive has affected her. Of course, this is the direct follow-up to whatever the case may be that explains why what's so important about this toy plane, and I stand by my criticism of that episode, and that toy plane thing should have been left out of the show entirely. I did love the backstory of Kate with her childhood friend and them being in love despite the fact that he was married and had kids with someone else, and the fact that he died because of her actions was extremely tragic. This is some of the most powerful storytelling that got me to love the show in the first place, especially considering this is one of the first episodes of the show I saw. But the power of the flashbacks meshing with the blandness of the island storyline. So it was a good episode, but not a great one. So then we get into Exodus, which IMDb has listed as 3 parts, but I'll review it as 2 parts because that's how it aired. To specify, part 1 aired 1 week, and then the next week, part 2 aired as a 2-hour special. So I'll cover those 2 parts. So starting with part 1, this episode is most known for the iconic launching of the raft sequence, which many people find really touching and moving, and I do agree it is a bit iconic, but both of these parts overall, I would say, have a bit more style than substance. And although I do really like them, I don't think they're the best of what the show can do. In a way, these episodes do wrap up a lot and personify season 1 quite nicely and sets up for season 2. But it does seem that a lot of the scenes were a lot of flashy and unnecessary. Like the launching of the raft, for example, because it's hard for me to look on the scene as a meaningful one when you know what happens to it, and that is nothing. And nothing becomes of this. And the flashbacks of these episodes showing the various characters right before they boarded the plane was kind of a lot of pomp and circumstance, as it's kind of cool to see the show celebrating itself and seeing these characters come together on the plane, but it doesn't build these characters or develop them in any way. Although I will say I didn't hate them as much as my brother has to my recollection. I think he thought these were horrible. I wouldn't say they were horrible, they just weren't that necessary. Although there were good things about Exodus Part 1, such as the scene where Sawyer finally tells Jack about his encounter with Jack's father and how his father forgave him. That was a very powerful scene and a great character moment for both Sawyer and Jack. Plus, the through story of Rousseau coming into the camp and warning that the others were coming, very effectively suspenseful story. And the black smoke appearing just as she said it would gives credence to her warning, making it a very effective ticking clock, which gives Jack the motivation to finally open the hatch. So that was very effective as well. So now let me get into part 2 of Exodus. This has a lot of nice moments and moments that further establish the mythology of the show. Most of all, it really establishes that things are coming to a head with Jack and Locke and establishes the man of science, man of faith dynamic. Also, you may have noticed that so far in these reviews I haven't used the term smoke monster, which is what it is most commonly known as nowadays, and that's because I was trying to keep it spoiler free for those watching the show for the first time, and because this episode is actually the first time that you see the monster in its smoky form, which I thought was extremely effective, as I thought it was important to see it again, as we hadn't really seen it since Walkabout, and the way it tries to pull Locke away was extremely fascinating and gets the little brain thinking. Also, we get to finally see what the Black Rock is, which they've been referring to all season, and I'm sure this conjured up image of a giant black rock or cliff or rock formations, but turns out it's a centuries-old ship that somehow ended up in the middle of the island. I love how Hurley is like, what the hell? How does that happen? Rousseau simply says, are you on the same island as I am? And Hurley retorts, I guess that explains it. It's a nice exchange as the characters acknowledge how weird shit just seems to happen on the island all the time, but at the same time, Hurley is just insisting, wait, I'm not willing to accept it or let it slide. I'm still going to question this weird shit. And of course, the iconic scene where Arts makes a big deal about handling the dynamite and correctly, and then proceeds to blow himself up. That was absolutely an amazing scene. And to me, it was one of the funniest moments of the show. One of the funniest moments of the show is when Hurley turns to Jack and is like, you have some Arnst on you. Great twisted humor. I love it. And we also get some payoff with the numbers being on the hatch as Hurley notices this and freaks the fuck out. Another iconic scene of Hurley screaming, the numbers are bad! The numbers are bad! I absolutely loved it. Although the common complaint about this episode was that it ended without revealing what was actually in the hatch, which seemed like a cop-out because the entire episode seemed built around finding out what was in the hatch. We don't actually get to see what's in the hatch, and you have to wait until next season. This doesn't bother me as much, but mainly because I watched this season so out of order, and so this actually was one of the first episodes out of the season that I saw, so I didn't really care that much about what was in the hatch. But I can see how this could frustrate some people. But the weak point of the season was definitely the storyline, or the weak point of the episode, was definitely the storyline with Rousseau kidnapping Claire's baby and Charlie and Saeed running after her. I mean, this doesn't really amount to much. She takes the baby, Saeed and Charlie chase her, they catch up to her, and they get the baby back. I mean, we get a nice Rambo moment when Saeed does the thingy with the gunpowder, but other than that, the storyline just seems like a way to give these characters something to do. Well, and of course, Charlie comes across the heroin, and so has a major reason of why he became clean is because he had to, because he had no choice in the matter, because he had no more supply. But what do you know? Here comes supply. So that makes it a pretty interesting character test for Charlie. And the storyline with the raft was interesting. Again, a lot of this, such as the boat coming apart and Sawyer having to jump in the water after it, seemed just like a way to give them something to do. But I do like the interactions between these characters, because other than Sawyer, these characters we don't really focus on a lot. So it was interesting giving Michael the helm of this storyline. And I love the moment where Jen and Michael bonded as Jen insists that Michael keep the watch. This was a great way to conclude their storyline this season, as it begins with the two of them constantly at odds, but then they bond over building the raft together, and this shows just how close they become. Even though they still don't speak the same language, that was a nice moment. And of course, one of the most memorable and shocking moments of the entire show was when the boat shows up and they think they're all going to get rescued, but instead the people there just kidnap Walt and destroy their boat. This was so shocking. And of course we get the classic line, "Walt!" Apparently the actor who played Walt gets a lot of people walking up to him on the street and going, "Walt!" Now, I have to admit, when I first saw this episode, I thought the scene was the dumbest thing ever, but that's only because I was watching the show so out of context, so I didn't really get what was going on. I thought they went out to sea and just so happened upon a group of random pirates that just so happened to show up and kidnap Walt. That was way too much serendipity for me, but it makes sense when you put it into the greater context of the show that these weren't just random pirates, but the same group that Russo warned them that was coming, the others. In fact, Russo says that she heard them say that they were coming for the boy, and she had assumed they meant Claire's son, but it turns out they meant Walt. So the camp was never actually in any danger. It was the raft that was in danger, as the others had a boat and used it to kidnap Walt. And the fact that they had a boat was foreshadowed in the episode The Homecoming, where Ethan managed to kill Scott by coming in from the sea where no one was expecting him to come from. And I have to say, knowing this does make the scene a lot better, and as much as I really didn't care for the flashbacks, there is one flashback in here I always really liked. And that's the one where Jen is approached in the restroom by a guy who looks like he's just an average white American, but turns out he can speak Korean and does in fact work for his son's father and is there to watch over Jen, where he reveals that he knows about his plans to run away to America and threatens that that can't happen, where he specifically says you aren't free and you never were. Now that was a creepy scene. Just the whole way it played creeped me the fuck out. And knowing that this did add a nice dynamic to Jen's storyline as well, because we learned that his plans to run away would have failed. The rest of the flashback just seemed like ways to recap each of the characters' backstories or flashbacks for season 1, so it felt kind of like a clip show in that regard, and I could have done without it. But overall, I'd say it was a great episode, just not one of the best. A lot of iconic moments, but not quite enough meat on those bones for my taste. So that's all the episodes of Season 1. So now I've come to the end of Season 1. I'm going to start a tradition where I name what I think are the 3 worst episodes of the season and the 3 best episodes of the season. So I'll start with the worst episodes. I'm actually only going to do 2 episodes for Season 1 instead of 3, because in my opinion, there are very clearly 2 episodes that are much, much, much worse than all the other episodes. And if I forced myself to include a 3rd episode, it would be an episode that's just okay, and so it shouldn't really be put in the same category as these 2 stinkers. So getting into the 2 worst episodes of Season 1, number 2 is Hearts and Minds, the horrible Boone flashback that tried to shock you by revealing that the 2 had an affair, but after making it painfully obvious, painfully clear that they had no blood relations. And on the island story, it was all about a hallucination Boone had after Locke gives him some island peyote. Total waste of time. And my number 1 worst episode of Season 1 is Whatever the Case May Be, a very poorly placed episode placed after Claire's abduction that tells a nonsense story of Kate trying to get a suitcase open, not because it has guns in it, which will be helpful for the plot, very convenient for the plot, but because it has a toy plane, and the flashbacks we see of her robbing a bank to get the toy plane, and a group of flashbacks that were completely and utterly inconsistent with her character. The whole episode was a misfire and a waste of time. Now, getting into the top 3 best episodes of the season, which was a bit harder to boil down because there were a lot of great episodes this season. So I'll start with my number 3, All the Best Cowboys Have Daddy Issues. A great character exploration of Jack and great use of flashbacks and how it ties in to the island storyline of Jack feeling guilty over not taking Claire seriously and desperately trying to rescue her, while in the flashbacks we see him struggling with the dilemma of doing the right thing but in so doing ruins his father's career. Just a powerful episode. Number 2 best episode of season 1 is Raised by Another, a fascinating look at Claire and the strange occurrences that led her to the island, which seemingly involves a psychic who wanted her to crash so she would have to raise the child herself, coupled with some very effective, creepy scenes that reveal that they aren't alone on the island. And my number 1 best episode of season 1 is Numbers. Talk about a creepy backstory. This episode so effectively combines elements of comedy, suspense, and the special blend of fate-based eeriness that the show does so well, while at the same time telling a powerful character story of Hurley as he struggles to be believed. Makes this a great representation of the best of what Lost has to offer in my favorite episode of season 1. So that's it for the spoiler-free section of my episode-by-episode review of Lost Season 1 Part 3. So if you haven't seen the entire series of Lost, you will want to stop watching this video now. I will be back in 2 weeks to give Part 1 in my series of how I would write Lost, which covers how I would write Season 1 of Lost if it was a reboot. This video, unfortunately, will contain spoilers up to the end of the series, so those who haven't seen the entire show should hold off on watching these. However, I will return in about a month, where I will begin my coverage of Season 2. So if you are watching along with me, you have a month to get caught up on Season 2, where I'll cover the first 8 episodes of Season 2. So you'll have until then to get it caught up until Episode 8 of Season 2, Collision. In the meantime, you can check out my channel as I do many more videos on other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching. However, if you have seen up to the end of Lost, you can continue on to my spoiler section, which begins now. So, first episode is In Translation, where I don't really have anything to say regarding spoilers, so we'll just move on to Numbers. And boy howdy, let's talk about Numbers, as this is another situation similar to Raised by Another, in fact worse, when the show is setting up what is very clearly a weird supernatural occurrence and then later tries to lead us to believe that it was all just a coincidence. Bullshit! Bullshit! And the case with the Numbers, the later seasons would have us believe that they weren't in fact unlucky and they had no powers and it was all in Hurley's head. I'm sorry, but that is the biggest load of crap that ever existed. No way is that the case. No way would what the writers had in mind when they were writing this episode, as far too many things happen just to make it a coincidence or happenstance or whatever. That's what makes the episode so powerful, because you know that Hurley is right. You identify him. You know that he's correct, that the Numbers are unlucky and cursed, and no one around him will believe this fact, which is very clearly shown in this episode to be a proven fact. Especially the fact that when you add in the fact that the Numbers came from the island, so clearly the Numbers do hold some power. To be fair, the show did reveal that the Numbers did correspond to each of the final candidates that Jacob wrote in his cave, but then he would later tell Kate that, oh, they're just scribblings in a cave, which I'll get to that later. But I think the Numbers do have some kind of power. They simply just, dropped the issue because the writers were too lazy to come up with an interesting conclusion. And the explanation they came up with for why, why the numbers were on the hatch was just because it just so happened to be the serial number that they put on the hatch. Again, bullshit! Bullshit! Also, they never accurately explained why the Dharma Initiative were transmitting the numbers for Russo to pick up in the first place. I mean, were they just transmitting some random serial numbers? Oh, God. Listen, I don't mind them being vague on what gives the numbers their power. In fact, I prefer that they be somewhat vague on some of the more supernatural elements like this and leave it with an air of mystery. But they were too vague. We needed a bit more. Specifically, trying to imply that they don't have any power is total and complete BS, which I do believe Damon Lindelof once said in an interview during season 6. When asked about the numbers, he said, "Oh, it was just a coincidence to have no power." That is nonsense. Nonsense, I say. Not to mention bad writing. So the numbers were unfortunately another dangling thread that the show never really addressed in a satisfying manner. It was still a great episode though. So next episode is Deus Ex Machina, and the main thing I want to talk about with this episode is how perfectly all the mysteries presented here were resolved, and in very fascinating ways. I remember when the show was concluded with season 6, many were complaining that too much was being left unresolved, and then many others complained about those who were complaining, saying that Lost has never been about providing answers, and never really provides answers. It's all about mysteries presented, to which I say poppycock. The show was always at its best when it provided answers to these strange mysteries and provided satisfying conclusions to these storylines. That's also important because as many answers we get towards the end of the show, we do get answers, but they're not satisfying. They're crap. And this is something that's showcased in this episode because every mystery introduced in this episode, we get satisfying, very important to underline that, satisfying conclusions to these mysteries. And so in this case, we get the beach airplane with the heroin smugglers in season 2. We learn where the plane came from, and we get the backstory of those involved. We also see Boone making a distress call where he mentions that they're the survivors of Flight A-15, only to get a response that insists that they're the survivors of Flight A-15, which is tied up very nicely with the storyline with the tail section survivors in season 2. And most importantly, one of the best examples of answers in a satisfying manner is when Locke was banging on the hatch, and we eventually see the other side of that Desmond was inside the hatch about to kill himself, and he sees the banging as proof that the world still exists out there, and so that's why he turns on the light. So satisfying. So BS to the show isn't about providing answers. The show is at its best when it provides answers, and this episode proves it. Anyway, so next episode is Do No Harm. And so let's talk about time travel. So in season 5, while Sawyer and the others are trapped jumping through time, they time jump to the events of this episode. The first clue that is given is when we see the light from the hatches in the sky, indicating it's the time where Locke was pounding on the hatch, which sure was shown in the previous episode, Deus Ex Machina, but it's implied that that scene occurs concurrently with the events of this episode. And so Sawyer then stumbles across Kate birthing Claire's baby. It was a nice callback and emotional moment for Sawyer, as in this time frame Kate has left the island, and so it hits him hard seeing her again. But the thing is, watching this episode, I noticed that Charlie and Jen were hiding in the bushes watching Claire give birth. So the question is, where exactly was Sawyer that Charlie and Jen didn't see him? Or hear him, for that matter. And while Sawyer didn't run into them, it seems that, he couldn't be directly across from where Charlie and Jen were because they would have a clear side of vision, be able to see him. So I guess you could say maybe he was at like a diagonal angle, but in order for him to not be visible to them, he would have to be kind of close to them, so then they would probably hear him. I know what the counter argument to this would be is that Jen and Charlie were so fixated on Claire giving birth that they wouldn't have noticed Sawyer. But in my opinion, that counter argument, while plausible, is thin, and in fact I'd call it improbable. The real answer is that the writers either forgot or were hoping that the audience would forget that Charlie and Jen were there, and it was just inconvenience for them, so just pretend that they weren't there. That's the actual answer. So next episode is The Greater Good, which I don't have anything to say about regarding spoilers, so I'll move over to Born to Run. And with this episode, I want to talk about nothing that the show itself did in the future, but a webisode. So at the start of this episode, Arts is warning that the monsoon season is coming and they need to launch the raft as soon as possible in order to avoid the winds pushing them to the south where there's nothing there. This creates a lot of tension and gives this and the next episode a ticking clock that is very effective in raising tension. However, just before season 4 aired, there was a series of webisodes called Missing Pieces that had 2 or 3 minute snippets meant to take place earlier in the show. And one of those webisodes, we get a scene taking place right after this scene with Arts warning about the monsoon, where Arts admits to Michael that he made the whole thing up and monsoon season isn't really coming, and then he tells a sad, pathetic story of how he ended up on the flight that crashed on the island. So I guess, they did this to explain why the monsoon season never actually did come. But honestly, I hate this webisode a lot and try to pretend that it doesn't exist or isn't canon, because in my opinion, this ruins the entire raft storyline seen in Born to Run and Exodus, because it removes the ticking clock and further makes Art's it makes him lose any credibility. And I know he doesn't have much to begin with, but it makes his character too goofy and unrealistic. It makes him like a cartoon character, and I don't buy him. Plus, Michael's behavior in both episodes shows that he is genuinely worried about trying to get the raft launched as soon as possible to beat the monsoon. Now, granted, one could say that he was just pretending to be worried, but that's total BS. It's very clear that the way the actor was playing it was in order to show that Michael was genuinely worried. He's concerned that they would miss their small window of opportunity. And of course, the real reason for this is because the actor was playing that way, because this BS about Arts making it up wasn't even created until several years later. Therefore, this webisode is contradictory and doesn't fit into canon, and therefore is total BS, and I disregard it. And it makes these episodes worse. So quite frankly, I have to pretend that it doesn't exist, otherwise it lowers my opinion of these episodes. And as far as the monsoon season not really coming, I'd rather that they go with their go-to excuse, the island did it, or the island is magical, which I actually think would apply here better than it does in some other uses. After all, we later learned that the island is constantly moving, so the thought that it could avoid monsoon season isn't so far-fetched. And it actually is much better than saying that Arts was just making it all up. Okay. So finally we come to Exodus, and there's a couple things I want to talk about with these episodes. First off, when the smoke monster drags Locke away, as it sort of seems to be taking him somewhere, and Locke wants to go with it, but Jack doesn't want him to, grabs onto him and throws in the dynamite to scare away the smoke monster. It's never explained in this episode what was going on, or what would have happened to Locke, or who was right. Was Locke right, or was Jack right? But one can infer the answer to these mysteries from what we see in later seasons. As in Season 5, we get a very similar scene to this, where the smoke monster drags a member of Rousseau's team, Montage, in a similar fashion. In fact, in that case, the smoke monster takes Montage to an underground caverns by the temple and turns him evil. And when the rest of Rousseau's team goes to investigate, it turns them evil too. And I'm just using the term turns evil for simplicity's sake, as that's essentially what it does. And in Season 6, we see it turns Saeed evil as well, so it is capable of doing this with candidates as well. So one can infer That's what the monster was trying to do. Grab Locke so it could corrupt him. Because this has also been established as the same general area that the monster grabbed Montage. That the area that Russo calls the dark territory. No doubt the name is given because of what happened to her team there. So one can infer that at this point in the episode, Locke and the others are actually near the temple wall. So something about the temple, there must be something about the temple that allows the smoke monster to turn people evil, because when it turns Saeed evil, he's near the temple as well. So that explains why this doesn't go around turning people evil willy-nilly, because it needs to be at the specific place or near the temple, which they so happen to be near, and so that's why it grabbed Locke and tried to take him closer to the temple so that they could turn him evil. So we know definitively that Jack was in fact right and Locke was wrong to trust in the island in this case, because the smoke monster does not have the island's best interest at heart. However, Jack deters the smoke monster by throwing dynamite at it, which is kind of inconsistent with what we see of it in Season 6, because it appears to be invincible and nothing can slow it down. But perhaps it let go of Locke because it didn't want Locke to be hurt by the dynamite, and who knows. So, other thing is, Art is actually right about the black rock and how it got in the middle of the island, that a monsoon swept it there. We see that in the episode Ab Eterno in Season 6. Although, arguably, there's more to it than that, because Jacob somehow brought it to the island in the first place, but Art is essentially correct. So, the last thing I want to talk about in these episodes is that I believe the answer to what's going on, basically the answer to the show, what is the answer to the mysteries of the show, is revealed in this episode in the dialogue between Jack and Locke at the end of the episode. Now, granted, it's only in very vague terms. It's extremely vague and not specific, but it essentially describes what's going on, where Locke says, each and every one of us was brought here for a reason, for a purpose. Oh yeah, John? Who brought us here? The island. And that is correct. This is something I thought ever since the second season aired, and when the show finished, I was vindicated. And again, I know it's vague, and I'm not a super genius for figuring this out, but I saw it as a clear case of the writers speaking directly to the audience saying, hey, here's what the show's about. And although it is vague and kind of a no-brainer, but still, you'd be surprised at how many theories I saw that failed to take this statement into account and come up with some crazy theories about mind control or aliens or weird science experiments. And let's not even get into the whole purgatory bullshit thing, although I think I will have to address that at some stage, but not now. But yeah, whenever I saw a theory about that didn't take this into account, I would bring up this little exchange between Locke and Jack and say, if your theory doesn't include this fact, the fact that the island brought them there for a reason, to serve a purpose, then your theory is wrong. And I was correct. Although you could say it was Jacob who brought them to the island and not the island, but, whatever. He brought them there to serve the island, so tomato, tomato. Anyway, that is all I have for spoilers, so I'll see you guys in 2 weeks for my How I Would Write Lost Season 1 video. Take care.